Recording.
Well, welcome everyone to the first session of Reform or Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg. To get into it, does anyone have like initial questions or just want to go over the background of the book?
Not yet. Me personally.
Well, does anyone know the social democrat that Rosa is going over here, Bernstein, and wants to give a quick rundown of him?
Could you tell us who Bernstein was?
Yes, I can. So Bernstein was what?
Oh no, go ahead.
No, if you want, I didn't read the full article that you sent in.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you want to give it more in depth.
Sure. Yeah. So as far as I can discern, Bernstein was someone who was Rosa Luxemburg's contemporaries at the time, and there was kind of a debate about like what is the nature of capitalism, right? And Bernstein's argument, from what and if I'm wrong about this, please someone correct me, but this is how I interpret it. Bernstein kind of felt that capitalism, as a natural result of like development of economic productive forces and whatnot, will kind of naturally transition to a point where like socialism will just arise out of capitalism very naturally, and there's no need for like a class conflict or anything. We just have to keep we just have to temper the worst instincts of capitalism. So he was a very strong supporter of things like a Norwegian-style welfare state, and Rosa kind of takes issue with that here. That's kind of how I interpreted it. I don't know if anyone wants to add on to that, as any other comments about that, but that's how I interpreted it.
So, yeah, Bernstein was very big on spontaneity of socialism. So he believes that, yeah, like you were saying, socialism will just appear out of thin air, essentially, when the conditions are right. And so that is what Luxemburg argues against. And these two lines kind of are paralleled with Lenin and Kautsky, too. So this was an ongoing debate at the time. It still is to a point. But, a lot of social democrats nowadays don't claim to be Marxists anymore. But yeah, so Bernstein was spontaneity. Bernstein was also capitalism will never come into crisis because it will always adapt. And that, of course, will be proven demonstrably false within the next 30 years after writing this.
Yeah, I think that really covers pretty much what he had to say. I think he kept calling it. What did he call his theory, or what did? Let me find it here. It's like means of adaptation, or like that capital would adapt towards social reform. Pretty much, it seems kind of ridiculous to me. I think we'll go more into it as we get into chapter 1. But does anyone have like a definition for like what is reformism, and why does Rosa Luxemburg argue that what this reflects, the petty bourgeois party and the tendencies of the petty bourgeois?
I want to add another thing. The previous point is that he was also saying, as we will see in the which chapter, that the basic tenet that the ruling class is getting smaller and smaller, and the exploited classes are getting larger in number. He was claiming that that's also false because look how many people own shares, right? And that's the argument he uses against socialism. Instead of making everything a property of all people, it's already starting to become a property of all people, so everything is alright. We're on the right track.
So, are you saying Bernstein thought that socialism would arise out of majoritarianism, when the proletariat became so big in numbers that they would just, by nature, control everything?
So one of the basic principles of historical materialism is that there's a ruling class which keeps getting smaller and smaller, and there's an exploited class which keeps growing. And under capitalism, there's going to be fewer and fewer capitalists, and there's going to be more proletarians. But he's claiming that that's not true, that history materialism isn't right, because there's actually more shareholders than before. Because now everyone can afford to buy a single share.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I didn't have anything.
I was just gonna say that, I mean, like, going off of Danny, that, I mean, his tendency, like, as she was talking about here, man, in the book that I have, it's page 444. I don't know what the PDF is. It's the second paragraph of the book, and she goes over saying his theory tends to counsel us to renounce the social transformation, the final goal of social democracy, and inevitably to make social reform the mean of class struggle is its aim. So it's like, it's almost a veil of socialism through capitalist or capital's change in Bernstein's eyes. Like, capital will inevitably go through social reforms, and it kind of strips away class struggle. And that's what she talks about furthermore in chapter 1 of the book. Does anyone have anything else on the introduction of Reform Revolution? Would anyone like to give a definition of reformism?
I can do that. Or no, go ahead, whoever was going to speak.
Well, reformism in general would be like, as it is that Rosa Luxemburg describes it within the text, it would be to not have a economic or political revolution, but to work within the confines of the bourgeois state apparatus and trying to just reform, institute like new laws or new like that are friendly towards the working class, but isn't for a revolution for people to take over state power.
The distinction so the distinction that I saw she made in here was what you said was right, Peter Milo, but the main distinction that I saw was social democracy versus socialism. So it's reforms. Are they a means or are they the end? So socialists fight for reforms to advance the class struggle, whereas the social democrats, the non-scientific socialists, they advance their reforms because their reforms are what they want. And so that's the distinction that I understood.
Go ahead.
Oh, go on. No, go on. Sorry.
I found a quote I like from page 448 of the Marxist-Leninist Reading Hub edition that I think gets to the heart of the matter. At this part, Rosa says the latter referring to social democracy. So, social democracy must not direct its daily activity toward the conquest of political power, but toward the betterment of the condition of the working class within the existing order. It must not expect to institute socialism as a result of political and social crisis, but should build socialism by means of the progressive extension of social control and the gradual application of the principle of cooperation. So I guess to boil it down is are you trying to get political power to impose a dictatorship of the proletariat, or are you just trying to make people's lives more comfortable under capitalism but maintain the exploitation? I think that's
Yeah.
a good definition.
Yeah.
And she talks about how this tendency of reformism tends to reflect the petty bourgeois tendency within the party. Does anyone want to talk about like what that means, and do we see that today within like the DSA or other type of chapters like that?
Well, I think that the meaning is that like the petite bourgeois class is like the class of people which are they're closer to the working class than the big bourgeoisie, which is they're like the small property owners. And I think in relation to the book, it would be that it reflects reformism in the way that, the small bourgeois class, they want reforms where it is that maybe like they're friendly towards the working class, but they still don't want like a revolution, partially because how it is that ideology plays in their beliefs, and that ideologically they're probably more close to the large property owners, but their interests are probably closer to the proletariat class.
Or rather that the immediate interest is closer to the capitalist interest as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, two things I want to touch on here. I want to circle back to what Danny said about the shareholders becoming a bigger class, like universal, and that itself is that is wanting people to both work and own. So that is a petit bourgeois goal, ultimately. So that does make sense. That does link. And then the other thing is, I want to link this to the old saying about how people. Well, this is usually about Americans, view themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires and not the exploited workers. And that, I think, kind of is not useful. Like, is a reflection of a kind of petit bourgeois mindset here, philosophy.
And I guess going back to my question, do we still see this idea of the reformist aligning with the petit bourgeois parties then?
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
I
think a really good recent example of this is how most of the DSA members in Congress voted against allowing the rail workers to strike because they were worried it would hurt the economy. The Democrats' fear was like it'll hurt the economy at large. But a lot of the DSA members sided with the Democrats to win political power and to try not to have an economic collapse happen. But that's a demonstration of how that position and line is inherently weak when operating within the system. They aren't going to get anywhere if they don't play by the system's rules, but if they play by the system's rules, they're working against the interests they're claiming to represent and fight for.
And I know, I think that's a really good example of what we've seen, especially recently with the past couple months. So something that Rosa brings up is how that reformism is unscientific. She goes on and talks about on page 449. She talks about the basic principles, the three basic principles. She says first, the growing anarchy of capitalist economy leads to the inevitability to its ruin. Second, on the progressive socialization of the process of production, which creates the germs of the future social order. And third, the increasing organization and consciousness of the proletariat class. Is there like something within it that I guess the fundamentals here is laid out in the scientific form of socialism that we call ourselves Marxists? What takes away from that reformists don't have?
I think personally, what separates a goes back to the quote I highlighted earlier. It's about like, are you willing to have some kind of a conflict, right? Like, are you willing to acknowledge that there is a contradiction between a working class and ruling class, bourgeois and proletariat, that cannot be resolved in any other way than through a class warfare, Or do you think that there can be like some kind of collaboration on the issue? I think to answer your question, Nick, it boils down to whether you think that on some level that you can collaborate to improve people's lives within the system, or if you think that's all like a farce and that the only option is to go butt heads with the ruling class, whether it be through like a strike or a protest or something. I think that boils down to the essence of the issue.
Does anyone else want to weigh in?
Could you repeat the question again?
What boils down my question is what made Bernstein's theory more unscientific in Rosa Luxemburg's eyes, I guess.
I would say, like, she disputes it, like, she claims that he disputes the first part of that definition, that the growing anarchy of capitalist production is going to lead to spiral into conflict and collapse eventually. So I think she's basically coming at him and saying, like, following a scientific socialist method, you reach that conclusion about the capitalist economy, and like looking at the material conditions around us, you should be reaching that conclusion. But he's not being scientific because he's not reaching that conclusion, I think is what she's saying.
It's not because of the conclusion he reaches, but how he gets there. So you look at how modes of production have changed over history, and each one has come in crisis. Feudalism developed into early capitalism, mercantilism, because of crisis among the aristocratic class and conflict with the growing merchant class. And slave society developed into feudalism because of crises of population. So when you look at the history, it's always a crisis that causes the change in the mode of production. And so based on previous evidence, that is what will change the next mode of production. But Bernstein says, actually, no, it's just going to come around through the development of capitalism without crisis. So that's why she says he's not scientific, and while her view is. That's the way I understand it.
And he's also unscientific in a more academic way. Like, he's just wrong about the data that he has. He has the wrong conclusions about the data because at a point he's trying to compare other countries, and he doesn't take into account that those countries are at different stages of development. So his whole conclusion is going to be wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at that in the modern day sense of like the quote unquote Nordic models of these countries have like more social democratic views, but they're still using massive, forms of exploitation in third world countries as well as selling their cheap oil and stuff like that. So um, within this social democracy, you still see exploitation of the third world.
Yeah, there's a quote here towards the end on page 452 of the MLRH version. It is the second to last paragraph if you're on the PDF. But it says, revisionist theory thus places itself in a dilemma. Either the socialist transformation is, as was admitted up to now, the consequence of the internal contradiction of capitalism, and then it goes on a little bit, or the, quote, means of adaptation will really stop the collapse of the capitalist system and thereby enable capitalism to maintain itself by suppressing its own contradictions. In that case, socialism ceases to be an historic necessity. It then becomes anything you want to call it, but it is no longer the result of the material development of society. So I think that I picked that quote out because I think it just kind of neatly summarizes the point that Sam and Danny were making. Like, if you just think that capitalism is just going to roll along and that it's not tending towards crises, then it's like, well, like, what's the point of even being a socialist? It's just going to take care of itself. So I think that's a huge enlightening quote right there.
One last question for the group, but if anyone else wants to chime in before, just go ahead. But how do you see this debate relate to the question of materialism versus idealism? So like materialism of the sense of, I guess we can define those ourselves, but
I feel like it relates because like so Rosa's theory, or the Marxist theory, but the theory Rosa's talking about says that socialism is going to arise because material conditions arise, which like lead to its development as a system. Things make it a necessary thing to do, like the increasingly violent crises that happen under capitalism force things along, they create problems for which the solution is socialism. Whereas Bernstein is just thinking, oh, people are going to make the nice, generous, right decision in the long run. Like, he's just placing an element of, I'm sorry guys, I'm slightly high right now. But he thinks people are going to institute socialism because the ruling class is nice people. Rosa thinks that socialism is going to have to come around because people make it come around.
Yeah, more idealistic, or as we see, or as we're talking about, unscientific.
Yes, I think speaking of unscientific, Sam put it really well when he said Bernstein's theory flies in the face of all evidence because it's a materialist, right? Like, historical materialism means we look at how history actually happened and we build our theory from there. We don't like abstract, like a bourgeois economist. Like, imagine you have two isolated people on an island and they go to exchange tokens. Like, nah. Like, and as Sam said, if we look at the concrete history of how modes of production have developed and transitioned, it's like he said, it's always been the result of some crisis, and it's always been a very violent and turbulent affair. With the formation of capitalism, you had, Marx talks about in another text, the peasants in Europe had their land enclosed by the up and coming European bourgeoisie, and they were violently evicted from land that their families had on for centuries. Or you talk about the legacy of colonialism. Like, you can't talk about the development of capitalism in England, for example, without the brutality of like the East India Trading Company and the colonization of Ireland and India, right? So I think how this relates to idealism versus materialism is Bernstein's theory is very idealistic precisely because it does not incorporate the actual historical evidence of how things happened, whereas Rosa's theory is very much more in line with the scientific point of view because her theory accommodates what actually happened, in history, and it explains that. And I think that's all I gotta say.
I think that really sums it up. I don't have any more further questions, but if anyone wants to chime in, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the word crisis is kind of, important here in this context. As in, I think it is what differentiates between maybe the two approaches to understanding history. But I'm also struggling with first of all, talking about a theory that describes history rather, as opposed to a theory about how to change the current situation. As in, for example, just looking at the evidence of the development of different means of production across history and understanding that crises were necessary or were pivotal to these changes. As opposed to actually waiting for a crisis or anticipating that a crisis will be the way that the current status quo is changed, which actually involves any crisis involves some kind of obviously opens up opportunities, and then these opportunities can be utilized. I like chapter 1 starts with talking about the opportunities, and I wonder how much. Again, I haven't read the entire chapter, so maybe this will come up. But how much is understanding the flow of what has happened, and how much is trying to anticipate what to do in case a crisis opens up to steer things in a certain direction.
Yeah, no, I think she lays it out pretty well. I don't think Luxemburg really thought socialism would automatically come into place under like a collapse or a crisis, as Bernstein imagines, or doesn't imagine. He more thinks capitalism wouldn't have more crisis, but it's more scientific than that. I think through the constant class struggle and the as more of the proletariat gets more politically conscious, I think she saw more of a political overthrow of capitalism, and I think that's what she goes through, as you were talking about later in this first chapter.
Yeah, I think, Madi, I think that's a fantastic question about, like, what do we do and how do we turn this crisis into socialism? Like, what's the plan? I haven't read the whole book yet, but I do think it's outside the scope. I think, like, what do we do is a good question, but it's outside the scope of what this text covers. And that's, Lenin actually wrote a book called What Is to Be Done, very appropriately named, where he gives an answer to that. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe Luxemburg probably read that, because I think they were, like, historical contemporaries. So, I think that's a book I just wanted to point out that, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Justin.
And I also wanted to say, too, look at what's going on with current events, because I think it's really important to relate this stuff to what's actually happening today. It's a pattern in the United States, right? That one, it's a very bad pattern that the police do brutality against, against everybody, but particularly young black men, right? And then you saw this with George Floyd, and this goes back even to like the days of Rodney King in like the 1990s and before that, right? It's a time-old pattern where there'll be protests, and then the Democrats and the liberal element of the Democratic Party will come out and be like, oh, we see you and we hear you and we feel your valid pain, and therefore we're going to increase the budget of the police department and give them some more, anti-racism training, and we'll mandate body cameras on everyone, right? And that'll solve the problem. But it never does solve the problem, and I think that after reading just this one chapter alone, kind of gives us some insight, because the police as an institution are a white supremacist settler colonial entity that descended from the slave patrol, and their job is to throw people into prisons where they can be, like extremely exploited as prison labor. And so, like, and all these reforms that talk about more sensitivity training, or we're going to put body cameras on, or we're going to implement an investigation or some rules, like none of those changes actually gets to the fundamental contradiction. You could call it the crisis of policing, right? Which is that it's a freaking racist institution that's designed to oppress like black and indigenous people, right? And if we don't, as long as we're not going to tackle that issue, nothing that we can do, especially in the wake of the Tyre Nichols execution that happened last week, nothing that's going to be proposed by anyone, unless it addresses that core issue of white supremacism and racism, is going to accomplish anything except giving the police department a larger budget. Which, that's like, oh, these cops are running around killing people. What's the solution? Let's give them more money. That makes sense, right? But yeah, I just think that's one very poignant example that is a current event that you can apply what we read to.
I think that brings up a very good ending note. Does anyone have anything else before we end our discussion?
I thought it was really interesting how she contrasted Bernstein thinking that they can use parts of the socialized means of production, like the credit system and trade unions and cartels that existed. Like, I just thought the quote, but by presenting in its capitalist form, the same factors render superfluous. Inversely, in the same measure, the transformation of this socialized production into socialist production. That is why they can be the germs or conditions of a socialist order, only in a theoretic sense and not in a historic sense. So, like, credit system, while it greatly increases the magnitude of financial crises when they do come, it allows them to be pushed off towards tomorrow. It also allows for like a system of resource allocation, like the banks orchestrating that. They're trying to optimize the system to produce profit, but they are still organizing the mass of the whole mass of the economy, all of the means of production, putting more money in things they think will generate more profit overall. And so Rosa would argue, yes, we need that sense of organization in a socialist economy, change its goal. We need an organization coordinating everything, but that can't emerge from the credit system and banking system. That has to emerge from somewhere else. So in a theoretic sense, the credit system might be good. There might be lots of things in it that we can use to make a system that allocates resources well, but you can't just take that credit system and turn it into that. You've got to start from the ground up because of the way that these systems, they put a salve on the source of capitalism.
Yeah, debt capital is definitely just a way to alleviate some of these pains that we see. Alleviate some crisis for some families, but obviously it comes back and almost hurts the system within itself that she was talking about. I think relating it back to real life, that's what we try to do with any book or text theory. Anything that we read is super important, as Justin was talking about. I think just continuing to see how this reflects in our day-to-day lives and interactions is really important.